Okay, I think we are set to go. A very warm welcome to everyone for this event as part of Indie Newsweek. Tonight we're going to be discussing why we need independent media coverage about the war in Gaza. I'm Natalie Fenton, a Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths University of London and also a founding member of the Media Reform Coalition. I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. The event is brought to you from two independent media outlets, the News Internationalist and Declassified UK, as part of Indie News Week, a new initiative set up by the Public Interest News Foundation to help raise awareness of the crucial role of independent media. Before we get started into the conversation, we'd like to let you know that we'll be posting ways in which you can support independent media throughout the evening. You can also post any questions or comments as we go, and after about 45 minutes, we'll start bringing those questions and comments into the conversation. But to start, the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October, followed by the ongoing invasion and bombardment of Gaza, amounting to what the International Court of Justice called a plausible case for Israel to answer on charges of genocide. It has since then dominated our news media. And when something of the scale and horror of genocide is happening, we would of course expect our media to report as robustly and as accurately as possible on what is going on, and also to hold those with power to account. This evening, we have a fantastic panel of experts from independent media to discuss whether this is actually happening, and what we have seen in our mainstream news coverage of genocide in Gaza. Where's it fallen short and why? How have independent news media approached things differently and why? You'll be hearing from Dr. Yara Hawari, who is co-director of Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and a frequent political commentator writing for various media outlets, including the New Internationalist. She also hosts a podcast called Rethinking Palestine and is author of The Stonehouse, a vivid and haunting tale of intergenerational trauma and survival under Israeli occupation. We also have Amy Hall, who is a co-editor at the New Internationalist magazine. Her works appeared in publications including Red Pepper, The Ecologist, Open Democracy, and her writing has been across a range of subjects on social and environmental justice, state violence, politics, and the arts. We also have with us Hamza Yusuf, who is a British-Palestinian writer and journalist whose work focuses on Palestine. He's reported on daily life under occupation for Palestinians, including home demolitions and forced expulsion and the conditions for Palestinians in Israeli prisons, as well as the British political establishment's legislation and policies towards Palestine. And we also have with us Mark Curtis, who is the director of Declassified UK, an independent media investigating UK foreign policy. He's also the author of 5 books on British foreign policy, as well as a freelance journalist. He's worked in the international development NGO world for 25 years in his past life and managed his own research consultancy covering international development and foreign policy issues. Thank you all for joining us. It is great to have such a brilliant panel here to discuss what I think is a critical issue of our times. So I want to start with a question to the entire panel, and I'm maybe going to go what is on my screen from the bottom to the top. So Hamza, I'm going to start with you. How has the mainstream media measured up when it comes to coverage of what's happening in Gaza? We can't hear you, Hamza.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, you're with us. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's been a real dereliction of duty, I think, across the board from the beginning. From what I've noticed, there's the way in which it's reported is there are different tools that the media uses whereby they either whitewash Israel's crimes and thereby facilitate them and equally downplay what happens to the Palestinians. And a few examples I can list off. So, for example, last week when we saw the tent massacre in Rafah, the BBC's initial coverage was deadly explosion reported in the Gaza refugee camp. Again, not citing, not mentioning who it was, the consequences, etc. That then changed and became dozens reported killed. an Israeli airstrike on Rafah. Now, that they named that Israel committed it and the area. But then the subsequent kind of few lines down, or even the subheading, I think, included the Hamas-run health ministry. And the media does this all the time, which is to cast doubt on what Israel does. So if Israel does commit a massacre in which they report on, they then cast doubt on the consequences. The Times did the same thing recently. They had an article on the 1st of February where they said Israel is accused of revenge demolitions of hundreds of Gazan homes. The subheading was homes, warehouses, mosques, schools, and universities are said to have been destroyed. So this is one aspect which I've noticed is when things happen to Israelis, there is kind of the emotive term, the emotive language. We saw this the kind of post October the 7th, the use of the word slaughter, horror, massacre, terrorism. When it happens to the Palestinians, it's a completely different way of reporting. So this is like a deliberate choice. They do have the capacity to report with every detail and accuracy, but they choose not to when it's Palestinians. And equally, one other way, which I've noticed that they do this, is with information. So rather when they want to, they provide the details and polite context, clarity, and the backdrop. So again, just last week, the tent massacre, The Guardian reported it as Israeli airstrike kills 35 in Rafah after Hamas launches rockets at Tel Aviv. And I was curious because I thought this is one of the first times we've seen the backdrop included. Now, my immediate thought was, well, if you're going to provide the backdrop, why then did you not report on October the 7th as Hamas attacks Israel after 15 years of being under siege, under occupation, and subjected to routine bombardments? So this is one way in which they kind of minimize and downplay what Israel does. So it's either omitting certain details or deciding when to include those details, depending on who the perpetrator is or who's affected. And the net result of that is where we have a media that doesn't accurately report or tell the story of what's happening to Palestinians.
I think that's crucial points, and that those what we tend to forget to look for are omissions in reporting, which is really crucial, and in any type of critique of the framing of particular events that we've seen done in very particular ways, I think, over the past few months. Yara, over to you.
I think it's understandable when people say that the mainstream media has measured up very poorly when it comes to the coverage of the genocide in Gaza. But I think that's premised on an understanding of the Western mainstream media's fairness, speaking truth to power. And we know that that's not to be the case, especially for those of us from and living in the global South. The Western mainstream media routinely reports on our lived experience with systemic bias and racism. So in that sense, the Western mainstream media has measured up well. It's not let us down in terms of its routine misreporting and, quite frankly, complicity in Palestinian dehumanization. And it's not a flippant remark to make. I think that the genocide in Gaza has really laid bare the inherent racism in the Western mainstream media. And I think, even staff at these media outlets have been reporting this to be the case. We can look, for example, at the language that is being used in the coverage of the genocide. And Hamza already mentioned and touched upon this. But for example, the reporting on the October 7th Hamas operation, we saw editorials run headlines with phrases such as murderous rampage, bloodthirsty attack. International journalists and outlets all lapped up these comparisons of ISIS and all the gruesome stories that were coming out from the Israeli security forces on the scene, stories that would actually later be debunked, even by Israeli media, such as the 40 beheaded babies, really awful stuff. And so all of these descriptors, such as murderous, bloodthirsty, barbaric, uncivilized, these are routinely used to describe Hamas and other Palestinian groups. And then conversely, nowhere are these terms applied to Israeli regime forces, despite their slaughter of now nearly over 40,000 Palestinians in the course of 7 months. And despite there being so many eyewitness accounts and sources of really gruesome cruelty that includes sexual assault, the burning of children, the torture and execution of medical staff, and much more. And I think it's not really surprising for Palestinians, because for decades, the Western media has reported on our deaths, the killing of our people in such a passive way. How many times have you seen headlines where X number of Palestinians have died? We're not killed. There is no perpetrator of violence. We simply we simply die, as if it's inherent in our nature, as if it's inevitable that we just drop down dead. And this is dehumanization, the fact that our bodies are less grievable, and it's a selective choice to report on us in this way. And we know this from years of analysis of the media, of the Western media, but also from journalists who are coming out and who are speaking about the double standards. You know, there was a letter from anonymous workers at the BBC. Various individuals have resigned from outlets. But I think really, you know, this kind of reporting reflects broader Western society, which unfortunately still dehumanizes the East and the global South. And many people are fine with that kind of reporting. It's one that depicts Palestinians and brown and black people as subhuman, as not worthy of the same kind of empathy as white people when they're killed. And I think it speaks to inherent racism and white supremacy that is still very much live and kicking. You know, just imagine if the numbers of those killed in Gaza, 40,000, most probably more, including at least 15,000 children. Imagine if they were from a Western country. Imagine if they were from a white country. The reporting would be a completely different story.
Thank you, Yara. So, you know, I think that inherent racism, which is, you know, we speak about institutionalized racism, but it's also built into those kind of ideologies of what journalism is and reporting of what journalism, which is also, I think, a Western ideology of what we think journalism ought to be in so-called liberal democratic states. And that notion of fairness is part of that, which I think, I mean, but even difficult to uphold, I think, even that idea, when you look at the coverage in detail, is how they can even pretend fairness and accuracy in this context is quite shocking. So I'd like to get deeper into why it's repeated so regularly and where we get to. But first thoughts, Amy.
Yeah, so obviously I kind of agree with a lot of what Hamza and Yara have been saying. And yeah, this idea of, I guess, this kind of false neutrality or objectivity that we often have with the media and kind of gets drummed into you in like journalism school, which has always been a kind of real issue that really annoys me, to be honest. Because in any type of media, obviously, there's also, you know, we bring, as editors, as journalists, we bring a lot of baggage with ourselves, and that is going to affect how we report things. And obviously, yeah, language, again, is a really important part of this idea that there's always these two equal sides to every story. It just gives this false illusion of symmetrical responsibility. And obviously, in this kind of situation, that is just not the case. And I guess another thing that we've seen a lot is, especially kind of in the weeks after the 7th of October, was this need to constantly get Palestinians to condemn Hamas when there was no demands on Israelis to condemn Israel's actions. And one example, during BBC Newsnight in October, when the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Hassam Zomlot, was speaking, immediately after describing how members of his family were killed in their own home by an Israeli airstrike, Kirsty Walk comes in with, "You cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, though, can you?" Which, he hadn't even, like, it's just kind of absurd. Sometimes the kind of the what kind of happens, and this idea of context as well, which we've kind of touched on, is another area where I think that the mainstream media lets audiences down. Even though it's something that people clearly want. We published a magazine about Palestine last summer, so before the 7th of October, which looked at the realities of the occupation, apartheid, resistance in Palestine. And then after October, everyone wanted to read it, because it was like, people just really want that context. They want to understand what's happening. And you just don't get that often enough in the mainstream media, and as well with the kind of humanitarian situation, and we're seeing a lack of explanation for why it's happening and an attempt to depoliticize it. Like, people are hungry, but why can't they get food? Why haven't they got access to food? Why are people dying? All of these things. And again, I think it's often reflected in who is being asked to comment about what's happening in Palestine. So often when Palestinians are invited to speak, it's just about the humanitarian situation. They're not invited to speak about the wider context, the political situation, the geopolitics that's happening. And one example that I've come across is from in Canada, where employees at the media conglomerate Bell Media told The Breach, which is an independent publication in Canada, that while the Israeli government and military officials were regularly invited to appear, rarely were sources invited who could talk about the occupation and apartheid, and that Palestinian guests were expected to express grief but not political opinions. And then one journalist is quoted as saying, when it comes to Palestinian guests, they're essentially brought on to cry. And I think that kind of sums up some of the way the kind of media has approached this. So obviously there's a lot of issues that we can discuss, but those are just a couple of ones I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, crucial points about the Palestinian voices and where they are included, how they're included, I think, in this coverage are vital. Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I mean, you mentioned earlier the omissions of the media as well, and that has been an absolutely shocking thing that we've noticed in the last 7 months of British-backed slaughter in Gaza. I mean, the sheer scale of British military support for Israel over the last 7 months has been completely covered up by the British mainstream media. And it is a cover-up because we at Declassified have been able to find out quite a lot, actually, about how the extent to which the UK is supporting Israel throughout this genocide, both from a military point of view and from a diplomatic point of view, and various other mechanisms being used. And these things are not, you know, they're not actually difficult to find. You know, at the moment, there are 6 Israeli military personnel being trained in the UK. They've been here for months, and the government has refused to disclose any details about where they are or what they're being trained in. That's not been reported anywhere in the British mainstream media, as far as I'm aware. Now, that was admitted by the government in Parliament, so it's hardly even secret information. So that is open information that the British media chose not to report. Another thing is that, you know, we've shown that Britain's undertaken about 200 military spy flights over Gaza in the last few months, using you can find that stuff out using the sort of flight radar and websites. So these are reconnaissance missions over Gaza, which give Britain quite a lot of intelligence, presumably, of what Israel might be doing in Gaza. So they know full well what's going on. Again, completely unreported. We found that there's been 9 Israeli military aircraft that have landed in Britain since the 7th of October. Again, completely unreported. So the British public must know virtually nothing, actually, about the scale of British military support for Israel. The only thing that's really been reported, and even then pretty sporadically, is the issue of arms exports and Britain's arms sales to Israel, which again the government has been completely secret about. I mean, they've refused to release really any details about what kind of arms that they are supplying to Israel over the last few months, although, you know, they're claiming that they've gone through these processes of reviewing whether those arms sales contradict international law, and they claim they don't. That's almost certainly nonsense. But that's really the only thing, the only aspect of Britain's military support which has even been touched on by the media. Then if we come on to, just to state briefly, I mean, the diplomatic support. I mean, I wrote an article the other day looking at Andrew Mitchell, the Deputy Foreign Secretary, who has been a total apologist for Israeli atrocities since October the 7th. I mean, he has defended every single Israeli atrocity and crime in Parliament for 8 months. And as far as I'm aware, no one has called him out in the mainstream media for that. You know, the collective punishment, the massacres of civilians, the killing, the targeting of hospitals. He's defended every single one of those things and has been let completely off the hook. So that is an absolute, you know, failure of the press to hold to account our elected politicians. But just to end by saying that, I mean, I completely agree with what Yara said. That's not why the media have been set up, you know, in the UK. These are not principally news organizations. They're financial organizations seeking to make profits, and they are political organizations with political agendas. And we cannot expect the British mainstream media to report accurately, because they follow the line of the state in the reporting. And we see that time and time again. I mean, I've been analyzing this for 40 years. the British media follows the line of the state. It takes the official enemies and it demonizes them, and it takes the official allies and it gives them a free hand. And that in a nutshell is sort of how the media works. And you can, you can demonstrate it and we can see it, and it's been proven by many people, including yourself and your colleagues at Goldsmiths, Natalie.
Yeah, sure. I want to talk about that a lot more. There's so much more to say there, but I just want to linger for a little moment longer on the actual coverage that we see. I mean, you're right, Mark. I've not seen anything, any of the issues that Declassified have covered in the mainstream media in the way that it's been done. And we've spoke already about framing, language, unverified claims, lack of prominence of Palestinian voices, and where they are included only for particular purposes. What about context? Because I think this is also key. How well do you think the public actually understand what's going on? I'm going to come to Yara first for that.
I do think that this moment has radicalized a lot of people and has educated a lot of people. So I think increasingly people are becoming more aware of the context, not just what's been happening in Gaza, but in Palestine, Palestine as a whole. But in terms of the Western mainstream media, I mean, that context is really lacking, and oftentimes they don't even give you the airtime to go into that. I've been on many interviews where I've been told that they don't want a history lesson, which is quite phenomenal, really. And there's a reason for that, because if you look at things very isolated from their wider geopolitical and historical context, you can really shape what's happening on the ground to fit your narrative. Because quite frankly, the Israeli regime does not look good if you place it in context. It doesn't even look good without the context. But as soon as people start to realize that this is something that has been going on for decades, and that the British government has been complicit in this for decades, that's when people start to realize that there is more to the story than the mainstream media is letting on.
Do you think they've got that from anywhere? Where are they able to get that information and understanding from? It's not coming via mainstream media at all. Is it coming via independent media in any way, shape or form? Amy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this context thing is really key, and I guess especially for us as a not a breaking news outlet, that's kind of our thing, I guess, is context and bringing together the different issues. And I think also, Palestinian journalists are doing an incredible job of getting the message out there, or not just through the media, also through social media and that kind of thing. And I think bringing that context together, and also the kind of international solidarity that we're seeing, I think is also helping with that context. So we have a columnist who's based in Uganda who wrote about kind of why people in the global south are particularly kind of marching for this cause and kind of particularly taking action on this. So yeah, I think that is there in independent media, but I also think that Palestinians and Palestinian journalists are the ones kind of really pushing that, and also have been for time, have been really kind of just relentlessly trying to make sure that people don't forget that context, and that's been really important, and kind of making sure that message gets out there.
But have those, I agree wholeheartedly, but have those Palestinian journalist voices actually been invited into mainstream media in the UK in many ways? It's one thing that drives me slightly mad about our mainstream media is that they're endlessly saying, you can't criticise us because we are the free media of, liberal democracies. We are everything that defines what a democracy is. And yet their coverage even of the killing of Palestinian journalists has been dire. I'm noticing we've lost Yara. I'm hoping she'll come back in a minute, but we'll, what is your response, Hamza, to the role, how those deaths of Palestinian journalists have been covered?
I think, like everybody's touched on, there's a, like you mentioned, in terms of context, there's a deliberate minimizing of, or even a complete denial of the facts, and it fits into the entire narrative with which the media reports, or the manner in which the media reports, which is to ensure this I guess this image, or this perception that this is two sides with equal capabilities who are just simply battling it out. Whereas if they begin to address it or frame it in a way in which it's occupied against the occupier, or the oppressed against the oppressor, and there are so many examples across broadcast and print where things are mentioned, or as events unfold in Gaza, and there's no key context. For example, Israel has now flattened numerous hospitals in Gaza, and yet with each reporting, whether it's the Guardian, the Financial Times, the BBC, the Times, and these are all outlets which, if you ask anybody, they will tell you, well, they don't report the same way, or they've got different audience. On Israel, they are aligned. There is no right or left. There is just purely like unconditional support and championship of Israel. And you see, for example, Israel will flatten a hospital and people report on it, but they won't mention that Israel's previously flattened hospital. Or Israel will then, like the twice that they besieged Al Shifa hospital, they said, oh, there's command centers. But the first time that was proven to be untrue. So the second time, when Israel suggests that it's operating on the premise that there are command centers, one line has to be included, which says previously Israel has lied about this. Equally, when it murders journalists, we know way before October 7th, the prominent journalist Shirin Abu was murdered. But again, when they kill journalists, there's no mention that it's a war crime. There's no mention that Israel's previously lied about murdering journalists. There's no suggestion that Israel investigates itself and clears itself, etc. All of these are part of the key context and a wider, which add crucial details for people, because if the average person who isn't as clued up reads and finds out, oh, actually Israel's routinely bombed hospitals on the basis of flimsy evidence or no evidence even, then it changes the way in which it's viewed. But if they provide those facts, they then have to paint Israel in a negative light and provide the reality of the situation on the ground. And as everybody's alluded to, that's not what they're there to do. And if I can, just one quick point. We have this thing in the media where especially the British media, we think we're the mainstream media thinks they're like trailblazers. So they'll happily report on, the Guardian had the piece about the CNN staff within CNN who are not reporting, etc. But the Guardian platform's Jonathan Friedland, who has basically praised or defended the Nakba and said, oh, it's the creation of the Jewish state, and he mentioned the crimes of the Zionists, and he said it was a moral necessity. So we tend to look at the other side as if, look, we are trailblazers, we are fearless journalists, etc., etc. But that's not the case. And all it takes is a small dig or a small look into the archives to see that the coverage is very much skewed.
Absolutely, and it kind of amazes me that they are not working with Palestinian journalists. I do not understand that. If that is, I just don't get that at all. In any, I don't think that's defensible in any way, shape, or form. Can I also go back to Amy's point about the ways in which people are very aware now that these protests for Palestine are spreading globally around the world, and there is a sense in which, as Yara said, sorry, now Hamza in my window, Yara, but as Yara said, people are becoming actually far more aware, despite mainstream media, because the protest movement is growing, and in some ways that's gives you a little bit of hope. But what I'm also struck by is the paucity of coverage on that protest movement itself. So we're not told about we've had the 14th huge national demonstration in London, for example. I mean, these are huge, hundreds of thousands of people, and it gets completely downplayed in every outlet. It's student protests on multiple campuses. It gets a flutter of coverage, but then not much after that. Mark, what are your thoughts on the coverage of the actual protests?
Yeah, I mean, the point of these news organizations is not really to report the news. That's not their role. They say that's their role, but if they're another company, they get done under the Fair Trade Act, for misrepresenting what their role is. They're highly selective about what's covered and what's not covered. And as I said before, what's covered and what's not covered tends to follow the priorities of the state. And it's not a conspiracy, although sometimes it is a conspiracy, actually. I mean, sometimes there are decisions taken not to cover, I think, some things, but to cover other things. And obviously they do have political agendas, and to that extent, that can be a planned sort of campaign of a kind of attack or defense of whatever subject it is. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that these are journalists sort of failing, really. I think that there's an agenda out there, and they don't want to report the scale of the anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian feeling, because all of the media are on Israel's side. In fact, Professor Des Friedman, who's one of your colleagues, Natalie, obviously, who you'll know very well, has written several articles for us, actually demonstrating, along with Hamza, who's also written some really good articles for us on the media, have demonstrated that the British media is on Israel's side. And so what it tends to report will tend to be supportive of Israeli policy. And partly that's also to do with the context. I mean, half the time the media don't even report that Gaza is or was an occupied territory. With the most basic thing of all, that one side is actually occupying the other side and repressing a population where it has no right to be. I mean, that's quite a fundamental starting point for any report, and that's often regularly missed out in coverage. The other thing I'd say is that there is a real thirst to understand the context, actually. I mean, some of our best read articles, declassified, are the historical files, the declassified files, where people want to understand, well, where did this conflict come from? And, what's been the historical British role in Palestine? In the 1920s and the 1930s, under the British Mandate, where Britain repressed in very brutal ways often the Palestinian resistance movement in the 1930s. Israel drew on that repressive apparatus and now draws on that now to repress Palestinians. In 1948, Britain enabled the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. 750,000 Palestinians forced off their land. Britain played a key role in that, and that historical context is really important because it explains things to people. But I feel that that's almost the exact opposite of what the media wants. They don't want people to understand. This is not a public service. They have their own agenda, and it's not to do with the public interest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always struck by the comment that came through from the Leveson inquiry into press standards, where the political editor of The Sun said, we're not in it for the public. This is, it's a business. We're in it for profit. That's all we're about. But there's something else going on that you also point to, Mark, in terms of that entanglement and complicity between political and media elites that is also part of upholding the state apparatuses in certain ways, and also part of what Yara, you were referring to. We have loads of evidence now, actually academic empirical evidence about how skewed coverage has been. And a brilliant report that I have to mention, otherwise they'll never forgive me, by the Centre for Media Monitoring, part of the Muslim Council of Britain, who wrote a fantastic did a forensic analysis of the first month of reporting and showed just how skewed that reporting was in various ways. So for anybody who is listening, do look that up online. It's really well worth looking at. But also going right back, it's not that far ago, but 2011, there was a report by a book written by Greg Philo, recently deceased, sadly, who was looking at coverage of Israel and saying just how all the coverage was pro-Israel. That was the dominant feeling, and that any journalist who tried to report otherwise was actually fearful of doing so because of the kind of pushback they would get from on high. So there was, that we have a long history that starts to tell us something about why the coverage is as it is. And I want to shift to thinking about that now. Why is it? What are the structural factors that are causing this, paucity of media coverage? Who wants to go first? I'm Yara.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched upon it earlier when I talked about the sort of the inherent and systematic racism in Western media and sort of interests in maintaining the status quo in terms of global geopolitics. So I don't think I think for me anyway, it's easier for me to think about it not as a sort of a failure of the Western media, but rather the Western media doing what it was designed to do. In terms of the sort of the more structural sort of issues of like finances and governance, I think my colleagues are probably better to answer that. I have a British accent, but I don't live in the UK. I live in Palestine, so perhaps my colleagues would be able to answer that better.
Thanks. Amy?
Yeah, so I agree with what Yara's saying, and I think that is also comes into the coverage of protests around like racism. I think like obviously protest movements are always poorly covered, but I think a lot of the protests that we've seen have been, there's been a larger percentage of black and brown people on the street, which is obviously going to put fear into the British establishment's hearts. But yeah, I mean, I think there's like so many reasons why the mainstream media falls short. Obviously, it's owned by a handful of billionaires, the power of corporate advertisers, all of these things. But I think it ultimately comes down, which is kind of what Mark has kind of been talking about, is about whose interests it's serving. Because I don't think, although I'm sure budgets are tighter than they were, there's not really an infrastructural reason why most mainstream media publications, aren't doing more or doing better. They have access, they have resources, but I think it's just about maintaining the status quo. And I think that the narrative around Palestine is presented as tricky and difficult, and also, it's a bit sad, but, Israel has the right to defend itself, even if it seems a bit unsavory at times. And if you question that, there's like this fear of questioning that. And I think dissent on the issue was always kept at arm's length. And we've seen in so many workplaces, not just in the media, how any voices who may be seen as somehow being pro-Palestine are kind of silenced. And it's kind of used again and again when it comes to Palestine. We saw in 2014, for example, NBC News, which is a US-based media outlet, removed its correspondent Ayman Molyedin from Gaza after he witnessed and openly reported on the tragic killing of 4 Palestinian children by Israeli occupation forces. This year, we've seen it at LBC with Sangeeta Miska being removed from the air. And obviously, I think Yara mentioned earlier as well about kind of the BBC journalists that spoke out and wrote to Al Jazeera to complain about their employers' coverage of what was happening. And yeah, I think ultimately, the mainstream media is often set up to and continues to work for those who have the power. And that is ultimately the issue, I think.
Sorry, Hamza.
Yeah, one point which I think sure Mark might be able to touch on this a bit more is when we think about kind of the pro-Israel lobby, a lot of people kind of associate it with kind of the politics and the kind of Westminster, which is obviously, we know it's very extensive. But I think it was not too long ago when BICOM themselves admitted they work closely in trying to gain connections within the media or gain influence within the media, and they said that they proudly boasted about helping change the headline for Sky News or helping the Financial Times, frame things in a certain way. And it's well documented that they've historically taken numerous journalists over on these, similar to what the other groups do in terms of sponsored trips and, supposedly enlightening people and helping shape those perceptions. So there's definitely kind of that behind closed doors kind of maneuvering which takes place. And the other thing is what I think hasn't helped the discourse of late is, particularly 2015 onwards, is this shutting down of debate via accusation of anti-Semitism. And so many times, even if you mention the right of return, if you mention the Nakba, if you mention so many aspects which are central to Palestinian identity, you are labeled as anti-Semitic. And even now suggesting that there's a lobby, there is a distinction. Some people do use the trope of a Jewish lobby, but there is undeniably a pro-Israel lobby. I mean, all of those, the BICOM, I think one of the directors formerly of the office in Israel confirmed that, we have close relationships. Other organizations who work within the political realm have admitted, we lobby unashamedly for Israel. And that's something which is not quite touched on. It's still fairly seen as something which is quite taboo. But there are definitely conversations which take place, or kind of lobbying takes place behind closed doors, that in effect allows people to self-censor because of that fear, and also because of fears of being accused of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've heard people talk about it as the P word. You can't mention Palestine. You can't, you know, that's the, yeah, and the fear that comes with that is, I think, you know, that's been has that been a very deliberate, explicit kind of working towards this point, or, you know, have we got a kind of confluence of particular politics that's somehow come together at this moment in time? There's probably a bit of each of those. But Mark, thoughts on this before, and also why, maybe let's start with this now, Mark, with you. Why do independent media then do position themselves so differently? I mean, journalists in the mainstream media would turn around and say, but we're journalists just like you, but they're working in completely different contexts for totally different people or different powers. So how does what you do at Declassified compare?
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is completely different for anyone working in the independent media compared to working in the establishment or corporate media. You know, most people want to work in the independent media because they are independent, and people don't feel beholden to financial, or certainly not financial, interests. There might be political agendas. I mean, every independent media outlet, just like any other outlet, has a political agenda. I mean, no one can claim that they don't. But the independent media outlets tend to be more open about what their political agenda is, and don't hide behind some, you know, spurious notion of objectivity. So I think we're more open about that. But, you know, from my perspective, and what motivates me is wanting to tell the truth and actually to challenge the establishment. Now, I don't think that that is the same starting point as a journalist working at the Times or the Telegraph. I think their starting point is actually, if they were honest about it, is to get a good career out of journalism and raise their profile by getting a few good sort of breaking stories within their sort of very narrow confines. They're not out to challenge the establishment and to serve the public interest. So I do feel it's a very different personal starting point, and I think that means that the sort of the organization ends up doing things in a very, very different way than a big corporate entity would. And I think the deep financial interests behind the corporate media, they are very important, and this is something that, as you, Natalie, will know, the Media Reform Coalition has done a lot of work on. I mean, the ownership of these organizations by billionaires, and that's important because they are promoting an agenda that supports a sort of domestic and a world order that promotes the interest of corporations, you know, not of people, put crudely. And so again, the starting point is different. The interests that are being defended and the service being performed is a very, very different one. But the political side of it is very important as well. And Hamza's touched on something really important, because I mean, it has been a taboo subject to talk about the Israeli lobby. And I think virtually every journalist working in the mainstream is absolutely terrified of criticizing Israel, because they will get criticized for either being anti-Semitic or just being biased, you know, against Israel. Their editor won't like it, their owner won't like it, and so all the incentives are just to shut up. But actually, what's happened over the last 20 years is that a foreign power, Israel, has captured, in my view, a large segment of the British political class. And in fact, if you look at the figures, it's quite amazing. I mean, this is another thing that we've done a lot of work on at Declassified that has not been covered anywhere else. I mean, so it's 20% of Labour's MPs have been funded by pro-Israel groups, mainly Labour Friends of Israel. 80% of Tory MPs are members of Conservative Friends of Israel. Over 70 MPs are members of Labour Friends of Israel. And, you know, there are dozens of MPs who have been funded by both Labour Friends of Israel and Conservative Friends of Israel to visit Israel. Some of them have even taken money directly from the Israeli state, from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there's no other foreign state that has that level of influence over our politicians. If this was Russia or China, I mean, it would just never happen. I mean, it would just be immediately disbarred and there'd be a public inquiry and so on. But with Israel, it's been allowed to happen. In fact, it's been championed by the political class, and we have to ask a serious question about, you know, have our elected politicians been captured by a foreign power, and, you know, to a large extent, and does that partly explain why Britain is so complicit in this genocide?
And that takes us quite nicely into thinking about how this is going to play out in relation to the general election. And I think, you know, we've seen the Labour Party over the past week, you know, bar from selection Faiza Shaheen for liking pro-Palestine tweets. We have seen them kind of, you know, bring in a key Israel lobbyist into a safe seat in North Durham, Luke Akehurst. And, you know, so and yet we also know that only 8% of people in Britain support Israel continuing its war on Gaza. So there's going to be lots of interesting things that are going to play out here. I'm going to just ask for brief reflections on that, maybe from you, Amy, and then I'm going to move on to audiences, questions from the audience.
So I guess we'll see on election day how that plays out, and in the UK and in the US. I think it's made a real dent in support for Biden also. But yeah, I mean, I guess just on this kind of this question around independent media and why that's different. I think that there is often this attempt to sideline independent media as like not being real journalism. But I think a lot of people see through that, and I think trust is a big part of that. And we know that trust in the media is incredibly low. And I think in the UK, there was a recent report which said that just 34% of people trust the news. And I think that this crisis in journalism is something that independent media is an alternative for people, basically, and we're often kind of trying to seek to kind of expose those power dynamics that the mainstream media is often seeking to reinforce. And yeah, I think that's really important. But yeah, when it comes to British politics, yeah, I think we'll see, I guess, on election day how that works. But I think this has also been going on for a long time, especially with the Labour Party, but all of our politicians. And as Mark has talked about, like this kind of connection with Israel and with kind of how they have kind of played the political system in our country and elsewhere. Yeah, I think that's like a really important part of it.
I've got a question come in here from someone who's listening in. They say here in the US, the media situation is exactly the same. And I think this is referring back to what you were talking about, Hamza. The word terrorism is always applied to Hamas, but never to Israel's far worse actions and so on. Other than constantly writing letters to the editor pointing out this bias, what more can we as readers do? A really crucial question, I think, and maybe just raise your hand if you want to answer that, because it could apply to any of you. Go for it, Amy.
Okay, well, it is Indie News Media Week after all. So yeah, I mean, I would say this, but I do think supporting independent media is really important. There's a massive kind of disparity of resourcing between independent media and the mainstream media. And I think that, yeah, I think that's like a really, really important part of it. I mean, there's so much more that we wish we could be doing on Palestine and Sudan and Congo and so many issues. And I also think kind of challenging kind of the power of kind of these big tech companies, which are kind of also kind of gatekeepers to how people access the media, which again, kind of independent media loses out on. So yeah, I think that is an important part of it.
Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to say that if we want to have in Britain or in the US an independent media that actually functions in the interest of the public, we are going to have to finance that ourselves. It's not going to come from big business or from probably even not really many trusts and foundations either, although there are some, particularly in the US actually, that fund independent media. But it's going to have to come from us, I think, paying for it ultimately. So that's the sad truth, and that's why you know, we keep asking us at New International is probably the same as us. We keep asking people for their support, because this is the only way that we can grow. Because the funding system is not exactly biased in our favor; it's biased against us. The other thing, though, that is also really critical is I think we should be calling on people to impose a total boycott on the mainstream media. I don't think we should be consuming it at all, press, TV, and I think we need to be educating the public to say why we think we need to be boycotting the mainstream media, because it is so pernicious, you know, because it fails to report accurately, because it doesn't tell us the truth. And the UK, I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US, doesn't really have a concerted campaign to boycott the mainstream media. There are some organizations working on these things. I mean, I mentioned the Media Reform Coalition. Natalie's the founder of the Media Reform Coalition. Is doing really important work. Read its analysis. It needs to be expanded and widened, I think, to reach as many people as possible about the need to massively reform the media in this country. And I think an aspect of that is to boycott the mainstream media.
That's always a very difficult point, because people say in order to get that argument out about the problems with mainstream media, you need to play within, you need to actually work within the tent and work with them. And I know actually many of you on here have written for mainstream media as well. So how do you balance that with, because I hear what Mark's saying, it's as long as we play that game, we sustain the beast in many ways. But, how do you feel about that in relation to putting particularly issues around Palestine, around the genocide in particular, out in to a big audience, shall I say? Yara.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one because, as you said, some of us do write for, mainstream media outlets. And, I think the sentiment is spot on. I do think we need to move away from the mainstream media. And I do think we should also, make them pay a price for their complicity in the dehumanization of not just Palestinians, but of people in the global south and people of color in general. I think targeted campaigns are more successful than sort of, blanket boycotts. I think it's, if one was to choose a particular media outlet and encourage people to boycott that one, that might lead to other boycotts. So, for example, there is a general sentiment in Palestine that people won't be talking to the New York Times because of their particularly egregious lies and complicity in our dehumanization. So it's a difficult one, but I do think there has to be sort of collective decision making on this. I think it's fair to say. I mean, I get Mark's sentiment completely of boycotting the mainstream media, but I think it's something that has to, come from collective action and a collective decision, because I don't think otherwise it would be very successful. But, at the same time, there's the argument of, do we abandon those spaces completely? And I don't have a clear answer for that. That's, something that I also struggle with. I'm always in favor of independent media and really try to sort of avoid the more sort of particularly egregious platforms. But I think it's a difficult one, and I think it's still something that we are, collectively trying to work out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, people would maybe not have a problem in not speaking to GB News, for example, but they then would go and talk to another news organisation, which actually, when you look at it in detail, is not doing something much better, but they're happy to talk to that. So I think it's an ongoing discussion. Of course, one great boycott has been of The Sun in Liverpool because of its coverage of the Hillsborough disaster. So, there is precedent for it. There's another question come into the chat that says all very interesting, frequently discussed by independent media, but the question is, what are we going to do to change the situation? We have a strong and independent media sector, which is by its very nature fragmented. There's no one-stop shop to find alternative information on a variety of topics. So you have to choose a media outlet for each topic. When will there be a creative approach to unifying the strength of independent media? Yeah, good question. When? You know, I quite like that idea, actually, of, you know, we're not competing with each other in the independent media sector. We're working, you know, we're all working in, you know, maybe in particular niches, but we're all working in a kind of, you know, for politics that is broadly aligned. So why aren't we helping each other more? Any answers?
I mean, I think there have been quite a lot of attempts to do that. I know in the UK, for example, we've got the Independent Media Association, which NI and Declassified UK are part of. And there have been quite a lot of attempts to collaborate within that. I think one of the main issues with that is just capacity, I think, which I know sounds kind of bizarre when it's like, you know, working together should help us out more, but I think sometimes just being able to like get to those meetings and do those things, and that idea of a kind of aggregator of like different independent media has been around for so many years, but I don't think anyone's managed to quite nail it. But yeah, it is an interesting point. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on that.
Can I just say, I mean, I kind of still think, that the beauty of the independent media sector is the fact that we are smallish and not too big, because the bigger you try and become, the more conservative really you kind of become, because it's partly linked to funding. But it is true also that if we are going to challenge the sheer power of the mainstream media, these mega corporations, we are going to have to either work together more efficiently, or we are going to have to grow beyond our kind of comfortable small niche, because we've got to get millions of people on a regular basis reading and consuming our news rather than going to the Telegraph or the Guardian, you know. So how are we going to do that? I mean, it's absolutely not a straightforward question, because we are all constrained by funding, and it wouldn't be a good idea if any of us suddenly came into £15 million either, because you know that might constrain us. If you look at what happened, for example, I mean, I mentioned The Intercept in the US. The Intercept, I think, has been conservatized by having too much money. It lost its sort of radical niche that it had in its earlier days. I wouldn't want that to happen to Declassified. You know, I kind of see us as a little bit similar to The Intercept, but not that it's a danger that someone's going to suddenly give us £15 million. But we do need to manage our growth, I think, probably more strategically, and we do need a coordinating body and a range of mechanisms where we talk to each other more about how we grow and how we reach more people, and how we have some sort of collective action. I mean, I agree, obviously, with what Yara is saying about, it needs to be a collective action to decide on boycotting the mainstream media. Yeah, absolutely. But that's exactly the sort of kind of joint project or joint working we should be talking to each other more about, I think, so that we do have a kind of united approach to the extent that's possible, to achieve our objectives.
I actually think on an issue such as Gaza, actually having some kind of coordinated activity or work could be incredibly productive. It could actually, you know, really be generative. So, and I wonder whether it's an issue-based thing that would really enable that in its first throes. But anyway, I've got another question I must ask as we're moving on, because I think it's a useful one. Please, could you comment on Al Jazeera's coverage? Not independent media, but arguably putting out some of the best coverage on the situation in Gaza. So, Hamza, you haven't spoken for a while.
Yeah, I think Al Jazeera has almost been giving lessons in how to accurately report. And one of the key things that they've done is constantly platform Palestinians and those on the ground. And that's one of the key things which the media here tends not to do. So when they turn around and they have these fancy investigations months later, oh, you know, breakthrough information that, you know, actually Israel was lying about command centers. All you have to check is Martez's Instagram or Bissan's report, and you would have known that when they were pounding Gaza to begin with. So I think Al Jazeera has had that perfect blend of kind of uncensored coverage and also getting the voices and perspectives on the ground, and that flies in the face of everything that kind of the media here does. Over here, it's all about it's all about perception. And from my experience, sorry to go off on a bit of a tangent, but I remember going on a couple of broadcast stations here and immediately being told afterwards by the producer, can you now recommend a few other British-Palestinians, because we can't keep having the same ones, and we need to. He effectively said we need to basically fill a quota. And it's all about kind of showing this perception that, look, we are platforming Palestinians, we're having Palestinians on, and it's all about saying, look, nobody can accuse us of being biased, but if you actually listen to what's being said, or if you listen to how they're shut down when they say certain things, that's a completely different idea. But yeah, Al Jazeera has been much better in their coverage, and they haven't shied away from using the words genocide, from ethnic cleansing, mass slaughter, and that is how to accurately describe what is going on in Gaza at the minute, because as I said, those terms have been used by the media: slaughter, massacre, horror, terrorism, but reserved exclusively for October the 7th. So this one-sided approach is there's a direct contrast with how Al Jazeera operate and how the mainstream media operate, and that's effectively why they're dismissed, isn't it? It's anybody who says, oh, but Al Jazeera reported this, you see comments on Twitter, and journalists, I'm sure they see those comments, but they choose to ignore, because obviously it's an uncomfortable truth.
And Yara, presumably this speaks also to your analysis of Western media being, coming from a particular ideological position, is that actually Al Jazeera is starting from a different place.
Yeah, they are starting from a different place, and that, you know, they're a beloved channel by, you know, Palestinians in Palestine because of their extensive coverage. Al Jazeera English is quite different to Al Jazeera Arabic, actually, in their reporting and their coverage. You know, nearly every household in Palestine will have Al Jazeera Arabic on in the background. We are such a fragmented community. In a way, it's how we, you know, stay up to date with each other. I mean, less so with now Telegram channels and social media, but it's still a very, you know, very dominant feature of Palestinian life. And for the, you know, the coverage of the genocide in Gaza, I mean, Hamza mentioned this, you know, it's really been unprecedented. It's just been, you know, constant live streaming, literally live streaming war crimes in front of our very eyes. And I think a lot of their footage has actually captured things that have, you know, others that no one else has been able to capture, and we're only sort of seeing a lot of that being released now. It's also important to mention that, you know, Al Jazeera is also mainstream media in the Arab world, so it's not an independent media outlet, and I think that's critical to mention, because we've been talking about mainstream media, but much of our discussion, we've been talking about Western mainstream media. So I do think it's important to make that distinction as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely vital. Another question come in. I'm concerned there's an increasing pushback against the independent media through censorship and intimidation and criminalization. Even non-independent media like Al Jazeera is now banned in Israel. What are your thoughts on this? So, I mean, maybe coming to Mark and Amy in particular, has there been, have you felt as independent media any attempts at censorship or intimidation come your way?
Well, we have been blacklisted, as you know, by the Ministry of Defence, in the sense that they tried in our early days to kind of pretend that we didn't exist. And tried to kind of not answer the attempts that we made to get comment from them, which was really a rejection of our journalism. In the end, they apologized for it, actually, because the policy that civil servants had pursued in blacklisting us was contrary to the Civil Service Code. But I think it was an attempt. What it kind of showed is that the Ministry of Defence in particular is not used to dealing with independent journalists. You know, it's used to dealing with journalists at The Guardian and The Telegraph at the Times, compliant journalists who just rehash their press releases. It's not used to dealing with serious journalists who are trying to reveal what the Ministry of Defence is actually doing. And so I think that they tried once and kind of failed and then what tends to happen next is just silence. You know, you just tend to get kind of not noticed. You know, they won't notice you, sort of thing. And the same applies to the rest of the media. So barely a single one of our revelations over the last 5 years has been covered in the mainstream media, as you would kind of expect. I mean, that's the level at which, you know, they're operating. And I think these are kind of attempts to, and it's kind of a form of censorship in a way, you know, not covering important stories that the public are interested in, that are relevant, not being covered by the media, is a kind of form of blacklisting, censorship. We're not at the level yet at which protesters are in the UK, because I mean, obviously there is a massive clampdown now going on against legitimate protest in the UK, isn't there? I mean, that's what you're referring to, Natalie. That hasn't got to independent journalism yet, I don't think, but it could get to that point, because that could well be the next step in clamping down on kind of criticism.
Yeah, I fear for that too, and particularly as they endlessly seek to identify you as not real journalism, or it's not really part of the media. This is something else, which is highly politicized. You know, it's not really what actual journalism is all about. And so I do fear for that down the line, actually, the criminalisation process. Amy.
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, this thing of like independent media not being seen as proper journalism is definitely something that plays into this. I mean, for us, I think I think one thing that we've had the most pushback on this in recent kind of months has been when we've kind of criticised UK politicians, particularly the Labour Party, interestingly, because I think that maybe it's easier when it's like, obviously we're quite international in our coverage, maybe that's easier for people than when it's kind of maybe a bit closer to home. I don't know, but that's kind of where we've had the most pushback. It's not censorship, but yeah. But I mean, I kind of agree with what Mark's saying, especially when it comes to things like, I mean, when you see how like the BDS movement has been kind of the attempts to criminalize that in Europe, across Europe, and I kind of, and experiences I've had, I guess, in the past before I worked at NI when covering Palestine. Yeah, I wonder what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we wait and see when we have a new government whether anything shifts at all, which the next question relates to. If the two parties in the UK are both captured by the Zionist lobby and common business interests, how can we hope to reflect the UK population's vote to defend Palestine after the next election? Hamza.
I think it's a marathon, not a sprint, and there's definitely been some change in terms of that influence, and people are almost waking up. I'm not going to jump the gun and say we're there yet, but even just a small example: Labour Friends of Israel, they no longer have the list of MPs associated to them visible on their website. That used to be you just access it immediately. That's now changed. I'm not sure. I know that was a few weeks ago. It might have changed now, but I'm certain that they no longer have it on their website. We saw kind of the pushback with Pfizer, and again when they said, you know, the tweet that she liked, everybody was like, well, hold on a minute, that's not necessarily it's a normal tweet, it's a bit of humor. So I think there's definitely a case where people are now using their vote through the independent candidates and kind of the momentum that is on the ground at the grassroots level, and people are looking to punish the traditional system, whether that's the mainstream media, whether it's kind of the media and the politicians. I think there is a greater sense of apathy. People are realizing that, especially I think Gaza's crystallized it. I think most people would accept that media was broken before. You know, it was billionaires owned X percentage of the media, but I think the sheer callousness with which Gaza's been treated, the way that Israel's been supported, people have woken up, and numerous people I've spoken to have said, you know, this is, even if we don't get the seats we want in this election, it's about making sure that never again, in other words, never forget, never forget, never forgive, making sure that with Gaza Central now, there is a lot of momentum, there's a lot of urgency of organising and agitating, making sure that that is something that is applied longer term. And that, like I said, even boycotts of the media and stuff is switching off from even complaints. A lot of people have been writing complaints to the BBC, for example, for certain headlines, and at times it's worked. So it's about making sure that strategy is in unison. But there's definitely a fever at the minute about ensuring that, you know, the traditional system and those who uphold it are punished.
Yeah, I don't want people to go away from this session thinking they shouldn't complain about mainstream media. Even if we're saying boycott it, we are also saying complain where you see it's bad, because we need as many complaints to go in. You can complain directly to the BBC for their coverage, and you can complain to the Independent Press Standards Organisation, IPSO, for where it'll get you, but you should still put in your complaint. To most of the mainstream news organisations are signed up to that. I should point out that independent media also have a regulator that many of them sign up to, called Impress. And Impress is also, holds these independent media to, it tries to deal with complaints that come in around independent media. So they have a regulator that is actually doing a pretty good job, I think, in actually monitoring the situation in this sector. It's not that this sector is kind of a free-for-all. It is very much being held to account by its viewers. I've got a question here. It's saying, maybe for Mark, building on the boycotting mainstream media point, mainstream media should be held accountable for omitting to report a genocide by bringing them to trial. What is your take about pursuing legal actions against the mainstream media, Mark?
That's a very interesting point, and I confess I haven't really had that on my radar. I'm not even sure that's possible. Someone mentioned to me the other day, though, that as well as, the traditional routes of holding ministers to account for complicity in war crimes, which the ICC is currently trying to do, obviously, with Israel, and which we at Declassified are trying to encourage the ICC to also do with British ministers, because they are complicit in the genocide through materially aiding Israel, and therefore they should be investigated by the ICC, in my view. As well as that, there is the issue of verbal support to genocide, and whether that is whether people can be held legally accountable for that. Because if that is the case, then obviously Labour figures, senior Labour politicians, may also be in the frame for investigation under laws to do with genocide. So that's an intriguing thing. I somehow doubt that there is a legal mechanism to hold the mainstream media to account for not reporting things, unless I've missed something. So they can only be held to account morally, because you mentioned IPSO, Natalie, but as anyone is aware, IPSO is really on the side of the same corporations. It is worth putting in complaints to IPSO, but the chances of them significantly acting against the media are very low, despite daily violations of the IPSO code by the media. There's the editor's code at IPSO says that you should have accurate headlines. How many British mainstream newspapers have accurate headlines on a daily basis? Not many. So if there were a serious regulator in the country, then they could be held to account, and that is another that's another thing that we should be campaigning for: a properly regulated media system. And I feel that the Impress system that independent media have is probably better than the IPSO system that the corporate media has. But it would need to be much more resourced, I think, to hold independent media to account, probably more than it is currently.
Yeah, certainly IPSO I've referred to many times as a sham regulator. It doesn't do its job at all, because it is run by the industry itself. But it is helpful if, when complaints come in, we can turn around and say 10,000 complaints went in on this issue and you didn't do a single thing. That is still helpful to be able to point that out. So, it might feel like it's you are, simply, it's pointless, but actually it's not. I think that we still have to fight on all fronts there. A question here for the journalists tuning in: what can be done to make independent media a more attractive place to work and publish stories if the pay and benefits, etc., are better at mainstream media outlets? Debatable, I would say. Can journalists be blamed for taking jobs there? So, basically, you've got to put food on the table. You've got to pay for a roof over your head. So you go and work in mainstream media. Is that, what are you going to do about it, guys? Is the question. I mean, I would like to respond to this in part because labour conditions in mainstream media have plummeted. Though they are not particularly attractive places to work necessarily. Very many people, the majority of journalists, are on short fixed-term contracts now. And certainly if you work outside of the national media, the wages are appalling. So it's, this is, I would say that actually in the non-profit news media, you are actually much more likely to be treated better than you are in the mainstream media. You're much more likely to have adequate union representation. You're much more likely to actually have a contract that and people that care about you in the role, rather than just being a machine to churn out 17 pieces every day from other press releases. So, but that's just me. What about you guys? You work in the field. Yara, what's been your experience of working for independent media or mainstream media?
I'm not a journalist, so I don't work for independent media or mainstream media. I work for a Palestinian think tank. I think just a very brief response to that would be that, even for those of us who work in Palestinian organizations or NGOs, etc., being on the right side of history doesn't pay well. And that's not to say that people fighting for justice and working towards the truth don't deserve a decent living wage and appropriate benefits, because they do. But just quite simply, we're never in this field or adjacent fields, we're never going to be millionaires. That's just not going to happen. And I think if it's about priorities.
Yep, so you make a choice, you journalists out there. That's Mark, and then Hamza.
Yeah, I mean, it is partly to do with resources. The fact that, as I was mentioning, we are most of us are run on a shoestring compared to the corporate media. I mean, our Declassified's annual budget is about £300,000 a year, compared to the Guardian, which is 225 million. So it's obvious that we're not going to be able to pay people the same as a corporate media outlet. One of the problems is that the whole trusts and foundation system in the UK is biased completely against independent media. There's hardly any funders of independent media. That needs an overhaul as well. So there's a lot of funders of NGOs and campaigning organizations, but almost none of media organizations. So I think that's also something that there should be united action around among the independent media, to persuade potential funders of independent media to fund independent media. Like the unions. I mean, the unions, a lot of them have a lot of money. They don't seem to fund independent media. Why not? I mean, the left candidates get an absolute slaughtering in the media. So you'd have thought that they should have an incentive to actually fund independent media, but that hasn't happened yet. There's only a handful of places that you can actually turn to on the trust and foundation side, and that's why most independent media organizations are reliant on the public for funds. But obviously that takes a long time to build up public money. You can do it, and organizations have done it over the last 20 years. We're doing it. New Internationalist has done it very successfully, build up a strong public supporter base. But it does restrict, it means that it's not the same as getting millions and millions from corporate donors. So I think the funding base for independent journalism needs to be improved.
I agree, although there are lots of criticisms about the foundation model of funding journalism, which, just as you said earlier, Mark, tends then to depoliticize to a certain extent what those independent media are doing, because they're fearful of their next funding application being turned down. So there's, again, there's issues on, you know, certainly they face that in the US. Hamza?
I think building on what you said, there is a bit of misconception, and I think I'm qualified to comment here because I've written for both Declassified and New Internationalist, and I've pitched back to Metro Independent, and the rates are better at Declassified and Internationalist. And honestly speaking, there is a suggestion, like I've pitched stuff to the Metro before, for example, on Palestine, and the feedback I've then got about, they were like, okay, we'll take this on. But it is genuinely it's signing up to self-censorship, and the Independent is the same. I've pitched to them previously, and generally when you grow up, whether it's writing, whether it's video, you generally think, let me go to the mainstream. They must pay better, and then it reaches more people. But what you're then signing up to, by extension, is, you know, they're going to substitute ethnic cleansing for conflict. They're going to substitute, you know, mass murder for deaths, or etc. And that doesn't matter how much you pay. That doesn't sit right. And obviously that's just me personally. But like I said, there is a misconception that if you head over to the mainstream outlets, they will pay better. My experience is that you're appreciated more, and genuinely, the pay is not that great at the mainstream unless you're like a seasoned columnist or a commentator, and that, again, that's not reserved for those people who are looking to work in independent or mainstream. Those people, regardless, won't reach those, because that's just the way the media works. So yeah, there is a misconception that generally, if you want to write or work for the mainstream, you're gonna be on a huge salary. If you're looking to write, the independent outlets will produce better content, facilitate it, and pay better as well.
Yeah, you make a really important point, Hamza, actually, about who is working in these organisations as well at the moment. And we know from analyses of, you know, of Labour in mainstream media just how white and privileged those spaces are. And you know, if you go into them, that's what you're part of. You're in that club, and that is you know, lots of analysis that shows just how much that influences the nature of the coverage that gets written as well. So there are multiple levels on which, you know, it is performing a particular complicity or ideological congruence with the status quo, I think, in those ways that we are seeing time and again. So certainly, I think you do not see that in the independent media. That is, and there are conscious efforts on behalf of independent media to ensure that is not the case. And I think that's the real difference. They are setting themselves up structurally to do something different. I'm conscious that we've only got kind of about 7 minutes left. I'm going to ask this final question, then I'm going to go round the panel to ask for closing remarks. But the final question here: to what extent is the public disdain for the mainstream media hidden from us? Do far more people mistrust our news than is let on? How do we build back public trust? So one last question about trust. Is lack of trust for the mainstream media hidden? And if so, how can we build back trust, or build in trust, I would say, to independent media? And then around, let's go to Hamza first this time.
I think there's an element of it being hidden, in the sense people have that kind of that disdain or that apathy, but still tune in anyway out of, you know, habit or instinct, and that partly may be due to they're not aware of the alternatives that exist. And I think if a lot of people were exposed to, you know, a better nature of reporting that the independent media do provide, I think, but it's just a case of, for example, if you're in the car, you're going to switch on LBC, for example. If you want to find out some news, you might be drawn to Sky News or BBC, etc. So there's many ways in which there is effectively a monopoly, and so, you know, people find that they don't have a choice. And I think it's a case of putting the independent media out there so that people know they have an alternative. Because I think across the board, you know, mainstream media seem to take pride in being accused of, you know, both sides not liking you. That's not a good thing. If the right and the left are accusing you of something, they seem to think that's an excellent example of being bang in the middle and neutral. No, it's an example, and it's proof that you're not doing a job well. But because there's not enough, or at least not enough awareness, I think, where people think there are alternatives, and there are alternatives that can provide that level of coverage and that reporting. But I think a lot of people are maybe oblivious to it.
Amy, do people trust New Internationalists more, do you think, and why?
Yeah, I mean, that's what they tell us. And I think it's partly because they feel like it's, I mean, on what's happening in Gaza, for example, like people can see what is happening, and then they're turning to the media, and then they're like, hang on a minute, this isn't like, it's kind of like a weird kind of experience. And I guess on that, and that's the same on a lot of issues. And I guess, yeah, that is what our readers tell us. They appreciate the fact that we go into depth with our journalism. They appreciate the context that we give. They appreciate the fact that we're international, so we're bringing together different issues. And yeah, that we're also not telling them what to think, but we're giving them the kind of information to make up their own minds. And I guess that's kind of what people tell us that they appreciate. But yeah, I kind of agree with what Hamza said as well. Like, I think a lot of people don't trust the media. I mean, all the research shows that a lot of people don't trust the media, but it's almost like they're just not sure where else to go, especially when it's just to know what's happening in the moment and this kind of like breaking news thing, which is, I think, something that the independent media doesn't really so much do.
I should also say, for those, if any of you don't know, listening in, that the New Internationalist is a cooperative and it's co-owned by its readers. So there is also a mechanism of accountability written in to its ownership structure, which allows people a say in the sorts of issues it covers and the sorts of things that it does. So, I think that actual accountability is very rare I don't think it exists at all in the mainstream media. You think the BBC is supposed to be a public service. It ignores the public the vast majority of the time. It has no relationship with them at all. Whereas in something where you have a news cooperative that, and a co-ownership structure, you're immediately in an entirely different relationship. And I think what's interesting about it being the notion of independent media is actually what you get there is an intradependency. But it's an interdependency between the people who are reading and being there. So it's a very different sort of relationship. And actually, there is an interdependency between mainstream media and the state that nobody talks about. And that's, so it's kind of, they're not independent at all in any way, shape or form. But but I'm a great favour of that kind of intradependency that you build up with co-ops. I'm conscious we now have 2 minutes, so I'm going to come to Yara first for closing remarks, and then we're going to go around the panel.
Thanks. I'll be quick then. This might have been mentioned when I was temporarily cut off, but I want to focus on this idea of media freedom and who gets this freedom and who's considered as a real journalist and who's not. And this is something that the mainstream media has been talking about, media freedom in the context of Gaza, in the sense that international journalists have not been permitted into Gaza except on a couple of press tours that were orchestrated by the Israeli army in the north, and I think one CNN journalist who managed to get in via Rafah earlier this year. But notably, we're seeing many talking about it as an absence of journalists, full stop. And this was exemplified by Christiane Amanpour, the CNN's chief international anchor, who on the Daily Show said that the situation in Gaza was unprecedented because there were no journalists on the ground. And the host, Jon Stewart, actually had to correct her and say that there were indeed Palestinian journalists on the ground that are being killed. And so she then clarified and said that there were no independent Western journalists, which is not just so offensive, but it also, brings into questions about, the professionalism and legitimacy of Palestinian journalists. And I think this really highlights what people mean when they talk about media freedom and to whom it applies. And I want to end on this, and I'll be quick. But since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, the Israeli regime bombardments forces have killed at least 140 Palestinian journalists and media workers that we know of. And many of these individuals were, killed while they were actively working to share the ongoing genocide with the world. Some were targeted in their homes, their families were murdered alongside them. And yet, despite all of this, hundreds of them continue to work. They continue to pursue the coverage and the reporting. And I think it's really thanks to them that those of us outside of Gaza can witness the reality on the ground and are actually able to challenge the narratives of the mainstream Western media.
Thank you, Yara. Vitally important points. I'm going to go Mark, Amy, and then Hamza to end with. Mark.
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think that we should be thinking positively now. I mean, I think Gaza is a key moment in British society. Actually, it's akin to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It has politicized probably millions of people, actually, and I think it exposes everything. I mean, Gaza exposes that Labour's no different than the Conservatives, that media is not independent, it's part of the state in effect, and that the UK is a lawless state. And I think that it could be game over for Israel, actually. For the next 50 years, I think this state is going to be a pariah. And I think that the British government's adherence to Israeli policies is going to be an absolute liability for the British state. And I think it produces lots of opportunities for us to bring about a better society in Britain, including a better media, actually, and a more responsive political system, one that's not complicit in genocide, one that does actually react to popular will. We said earlier that most of the population are completely opposed to this genocide. The state is not reflecting that, and people see that. So I think that we're on the verge of potentially something quite interesting in British politics. And I think if we can build on it and turn it into a positive thing, it could have really long-lasting positive impacts.
Thank you, Mark. Amy.
Yeah, I guess just to follow on from what Mark was saying, I also think it's kind of brought like a sense of internationalism back to a lot of activism in the UK, which, I think is always a good thing. And, it's also like this sense of international solidarity, which I kind of mentioned earlier, which I think is really important. And we've also seen people kind of who would, should be kind of working on climate, also talking about Palestine. Like Palestine can be talked about by everyone. It's such an important topic, but it's not just about Palestine. It's also about the kind of international justice, basically international the kind of the imperialism and colonialism. All of these things are kind of right in front of people, and basically I think that I agree with what Mark was saying, and I think internationalism is also a big part of that.
Last word, Hamza.
Yeah, I echo everything that's been said, and I do agree it is a bit of a watershed moment. Like I said, anecdotally, I've got aunts and uncles who religiously watched the BBC before, or just out of habit turned to Sky News and to the BBC, and now refuse to watch it. And that's obviously just one case, but it's up and down the country. I think what has happened, the scenes that we've witnessed, and kind of the defending of it, the enabling of it, and kind of the doubling down of all of that, I think has pushed people to ask questions they otherwise wouldn't, and now they're seeking alternatives. And I think it's easy to say, it's going to get better, but I do think it will. And I think people, like I said, are searching for new answers. They've seen through kind of the lies of the media, they've seen through this facade, they've seen through the politicians, and there is definitely an appetite to look elsewhere, to get information elsewhere, and to actually say, we don't want to be part of this system anymore. And that includes the politicians, the media, and all of those who enable them. So there's a big role for everyone to play, but I genuinely think like Gaza has been a watershed moment.
Thank you all. I couldn't agree more with everything you've said. I mean, we know Labour Party has lost 23,000 members in February and March over the U-turn on green investment and their stance on Gaza as being quoted. So 70 plus Labour councillors gone, triggering loss of control over several councils. These are things which are taking effect, and it is beholden on all of us to make sure those contradictions are exposed and the corruption is laid bare at every possible moment. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for listening in, but a huge thank you in particular to the panel for coming and talking over what has to be actually one of the most critical issues of our time. Thank you for the questions that everybody put in. Before you go, a quick reminder that we need your support in the independent media sector. So please like, follow, subscribe, donate, do everything you can to ensure that you get news and information that you can trust. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion. Don't forget, complain regularly, and do join other events in Indie News Week this week. There's an awful lot going on and we'd love to see more of you. Thank you particularly again to the panel.